All right, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you guys for being here. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever in the world you are joining us from. My name is Katie Green. I lead marketing at Current Health, and I'm going to moderate our discussion today. Quick note for housekeeping as we get started, we are recording this session and we will send that out to you afterward. We've got kind of a packed agenda that I really want us to get through. So I don't expect we'll have much time for a live audience Q&A at the end, but our speakers' email addresses are here. I'll show them again at the end in case you have any questions you would like to follow up with us about. You're welcome to email those directly. I'm joined today by our two expert speakers. I've got Chris McGee, our CEO and co-founder of Current Health, and Dr. Matt Wilkes, our Chief Medical Officer, who are going to be walking us through this exciting world of evolving delivery models for CAR-T, bispecifics, and other specialty therapies. So I see we've got a bunch of kind of new names that are joining us for our conversation today. Before we really get into the meat and potatoes of it, Chris, if you don't mind, would you kind of give our friends a high-level overview of Current Health and how we fit into this space?
Of course. Hey, everyone. Thanks so much for attending. My name, as Katie said, is Chris McGee. I'm Current Health's CEO and co-founder. Current Health is a Boston and Edinburgh back in Scotland based company. We're most commonly known for our work in acute care at home, supporting hospital at home programs across the United States. Hospital at home's obviously going through a little bit of a turbulent period this week with the government shutdown, which we all, fingers crossed, hope will end really, really, really soon. Second biggest part of our work is supporting outpatient CAR-T and bispecific programs across the United States. We help to eliminate the inpatient stay and allow the patient to go home straight after CAR-T infusion or between bispecific infusions. We help to identify CRS and ICANS earlier. We've built with some of our partners a tremendously large data set in CAR-T of patients who are receiving outpatient therapy and who have subsequently developed CRS, and we've been using that with our partners to get better and smarter at how we allow early interventions. And we also do a ton of research in that space, and Matt will speak to that as well in a second. And if you go to the next slide, Katie, I'm going to do one more slide and then we'll move past this part. So what do we actually do? Like, first thing is monitoring the patient at home, using that data to help identify CRS as early as possible, and therefore allowing the patient to get pocket dexamethasone or early Itosi and prevent or mitigate CRS deterioration, prevent need to take them back to the emergency room. We provide all the support with model design, SOPs, ongoing research and publications in this space. We have our own really highly skilled clinical team. They're mainly ICU and emergency department nurses who've built really strong experience in managing CRS and now building experience managing ICANS. And then we do all of the surrounding logistics and technical support as well. So we try and make it as easy as possible. Everything's integrated back into the EHR. And this is really a primary area of focus for our company right now. So we're doing a lot of different innovation in this area and a real focus on it.
Perfect, thank you. I'm going to pull our slides down so that we're all faces. Great. Okay. I want to really start our conversation in making sure that we don't skip over the patient experience. So we're going to get to talk about strategy. We're going to talk about value and a lot of kind of those detailed lessons learned that we've seen coming out of our work here. But I want to start by Chris. Maybe you can kick us off of what's at stake for patients as we think about evolving these delivery models.
So, I think the first thing is that most of these drugs have only really come into market over the last 5 to 10 years. And there's another huge wave of them that are currently in the development pipeline. They're all very expensive, and that's partly because, particularly for CAR-T, the complexity of manufacturing and supply chain for them is much, much higher, and that leads to that higher price tag. And they also come with more significant risk and side effect profiles than we've maybe historically seen. And that has all acted to make them less accessible to the patient, despite the fact that these drugs can be curative or significantly change the course of disease. I think what we're seeing now is, as more of these drugs come into the market, as the evidence base for efficacy becomes clearer and clearer and clearer, that there's a bigger push to make these drugs as accessible as possible. We saw recently in Texas, they passed a law mandating that all state-regulated plans must cover CAR-T. So we're seeing an increasing push to make them accessible, but that means there has to be greater infrastructure beyond the traditional tertiary and quaternary academic medical centres to actually deliver these therapies. They have, they're moving more into the community. But then the second thing is, how do we make them delivered in as cost-effective a way as possible? How do we make the patient have the best outcome we possibly can? How do we not have the patient having to drive or fly hundreds or even thousands of miles to actually get these therapies? How do we get them in their own local community?
Yeah. Matt, do you have anything to add on that one?
No, just I think if we're zooming directly into kind of the patient perspective, as you said, delivering these therapies closer to home feels like a hugely worthwhile thing to do. When you think about the patients that are receiving these therapies, yes, they're moving further and further up the lines of treatment, but these people have been through a huge amount to get to this stage. And we know that if you can deliver these things where patients are, ideally as an outpatient or in the home, then there is higher levels of patient satisfaction. And I think even looking at it from a purely clinical lens, we've seen lots of benefits for patients across our kind of care at home models, not just in oncology. And if you can deliver these drugs to patients in the home, then you see those benefits, I think, really come to fruition. Maintaining the activities of daily living, staying mobile, staying strong, reducing DVT risk, getting rid of infection risks, proper sleep, nutrition, keeping up the morale, keeping up a social life. I think the opportunity to genuinely improve the patient experience here, as well as their clinical course, is very rich.
Mm. And that caregiver experience comes up a lot too, right? That and the burden that is often on caregivers when their loved one is in the hospital for a really long amount of time versus being able to be at home. I know we've also heard examples of patients that have been, as you think about like the number of times they've like often been through therapy and the exhaustion of that the outpatient model can sometimes be the difference in deciding to continue with another line of treatment, or deciding not to. So yeah, the stakes are safe to say extremely high for the patients and caregivers.
Absolutely. And we've seen that, in our own patients, those direct anecdotes of people who have decided to carry on because they have the opportunities as an outpatient. I think it's also my job to keep an eye on the potential negative effects of doing things like this. And one of my biggest concerns has always been putting a social pressure on caregivers, but we've not really been seeing much of that so far at all, actually. And generally speaking, it's made people's lives that are already very complicated that little bit simpler.
Yeah, cool. We're going to get into some of the things that we've learned about how to make sure that the models and experiences are constructed to minimize that burden. We've got some friends with us from the provider delivery side of this equation, as well as the biopharma manufacturer sponsor side. So Chris, I want to kind of dig into the strategic case kind of for both of those groups that are participating in this space. What's the strategic case for outpatient models on the provider side, and then on the biopharma side as well?
I mean, I think the biggest thing is how do we make these therapies more accessible? Pharma has spent billions, tens of billions of dollars developing these incredible therapies that can cure or change the course of disease. And then providers are obviously, the ones that are actually managing these patients and trying to get them onto the best therapy that they can for their disease. The ultimate case for outpatient is how do we increase capacity to do more of this? How do we make it more available? And how do we make it more available in locations that are closer to where that patient, is? And over the last, few years, these therapies have tended to be centralized in more tertiary and quaternary facilities. We're now starting to see more of a shift to decentralize that back into communities. Obviously, for pharma who've spent all this time and money developing their drug, they want to see it as broadly as it can be in the market in a safe way. Providers want to be able to take advantage of the latest therapies to improve the lives of their patients. And obviously, most importantly, at the end of it, the patient who's at one of the most vulnerable and scary times in their life wants to get a therapy that can actually save their life or give them a longer life. And doing it outpatient, especially in hospitals that are capacity constrained, that don't have enough beds. We have clients right now who, like in our working hospital at home, who have 50 or 60 patients boarding in the emergency room because they don't have enough beds. This increases the capacity to deliver these life-saving therapies to more people and do it safely.
Yeah. Matt, to double click on the kind of clinical perspective there, how does delivering these therapies closer to where patients are end up impacting those outcomes and the experience?
I mean, I think a lot of that was sort of what I said in response to the last question, really, that it's got the clinical benefits of somebody being at home and living as they would like to and at the maximum of their function, and it's got the social and potential financial benefits of being able to live in a way that suits their own lifestyle and those around them who are giving them care.
Yeah, great. I want to dig into some of the kind of real world examples that we've really been working on, focusing on our friends at Sarah Cannon. I think we might have a few of them on the call with us today. Thanks for being here. The Sarah Cannon Network is the largest provider of CAR T therapies, and they're now they've transitioned more than 75% of those patients to their outpatient model, which is really exciting. So, Chris, I want to toss this one to you first. We've done a lot of work with them in both understanding what this looks like from a quantitative perspective and pulling out those key lessons learned about what it takes to do this safely and at scale. What is something that really stands out to you about that playbook that we've been building together?
I mean, I think the first thing is just the sheer amount of institutional buy-in and operational and clinical leadership that the Sarah Cannon team have. I mean, I look at people like Tonya and Stephanie, as well as their clinical leaders, that they're incredibly motivated from the leadership all the way on down to the intake nurses who are consented and qualifying these patients to actually do this, that they're really, really passionate and driven about it. They really believe in it. And I think that's really, really, really important, because without that level of institutional buy-in, like up and down the organization, it's really hard to do healthcare in a different way. And I think one of the reasons that Sarah Cannon has been so successful is just that level of institutional buy-in all the way up and down. Like the frontline intake nurses, I've never met people who are more passionate about what they do than those group of nurses. It's remarkable to get to be with them, and the patients get that too, because again, we have to remember that these patients are it's really scary. They're at a really vulnerable and traumatic moment of their life, and sure, it's absolutely great to be told, hey, you can get this therapy and get it at home, but there's a bunch of concerns that spring up in people's minds when they hear that type of thing. Am I going to have to do loads more? You asked about caregiver burden earlier. Now, we know all those things are safely manageable, but getting those frontline nurses to actually articulate that to the patient and their caregiver and talk it through to them so passionately, for me, is one of the most important reasons that Sarah Cannon has been so incredibly successful. And that's true of some of our most successful hospital home customers too. It comes from that up and down institutional buy-in and passion that they have for doing it in a different way.
Yeah. So thinking about that clinician buy-in, that change management, Matt, can you give us just a couple of some of those lessons learned of what it takes to do this well that have come out of our work there?
Sure. I mean, I think just to echo what Chris said to start with, I can see Steph Larson from Sarah Cannon in the audience, and I think without Sarah Cannon's extraordinary partnership, we wouldn't have had the success that we've had. I suppose your question kind of reflects what it felt like moving from being a clinician to tech. When I moved to tech, I thought it would be all about the tech, but it turns out that is just one fraction of it. And really, it's the change management and it's how we implement these things in practice that matters. And I think what I'm always very conscious of is that we are just one part of a very busy oncology service, a tiny part actually. And so one of the things that I think is beholden on us is to minimize, because there will always be a little bit of an increase in workload when you roll out these things, because it's a change and it's always going to be that way, is to minimize the impact of that change, but also, like Chris said, find something for somebody at every level to incentivize them through it. So for the patient, the caregiver, the nurse, the physician, the support staff, up to the C-suite of the hospital system, there has to be something that carries them through that process of implementation. And I think alongside the kind of hope, the sort of future thinking stuff, you also have to make sure that you're capturing data as you go, because you need to put numbers to this. So yes, we track things like the formal measures of, adverse events or anything else, but also I think we should be rigorous about tracking measures of workflow and satisfaction. Like that's what helps build trust, not just in the institution, but with payers and with regulators. And I guess also not becoming hyperfixated as well. I think just when we think about these highly specialized drugs, then it's very tempting to jump straight into CRS or ICANS or things that are very specific, but actually taking a holistic view of the patient and realizing that they might be as likely to break their hip as they are to have one of these side effects, and making sure that when we build out these programs, we are thinking about everything that could happen and how that's going to fit in with the hospital's workflows and services as much as the sort of narrow oncology focus.
Yeah, one of those things that is really true across care at home models, right, is that especially when you're caring for a patient in their home, you're caring for the full patient, right? It's the full scope of everything that that they're going through. Okay, want to keep us moving along here. Chris, I want you to answer this one for me. Why do this type of model with that layer of technology and support? Is that necessary?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are definitely providers in the space right now who question whether or not monitoring and more technology is needed. And I think I've got a couple of different answers to that. I think the first thing is that it's on us as a company like Current Health to try and make sure that the technology and the services we are delivering fit as seamlessly as possible into both the patient and the clinician's workflow, and trying to make it as easy as humanly possible. I think the second thing is that absent some level of monitoring, you are largely reliant on the patient picking up the phone and saying, hey, like, I think I'm developing a fever. So there's a huge amount of reliance, and I would actually argue like more burden on the patient and their caregiver in that scenario than when you're passively monitoring them. And then you have to think about, well, what happens if that happens at 2 a.m? Like, how are we handling that then? And then the next thing is, and what's the next part of this? Like, we've seen programs who've struggled, tried to do it without technology, had to bring in technology and the associated services, because what was happening is that the patient would say, oh, I'm feeling a little bit feverish, and the only place of escalation for them was therefore the emergency room. Well, a bunch of the emergency rooms, particularly in capacity constrained cities, like the emergency rooms have tremendously long waits, and some of these patients, particularly as they're at grade 1 CRS, they don't necessarily look super sick. So they go into the emergency room, the triage nurse maybe hasn't seen this type of thing before, they triage them to the waiting room, all very well until the patient suddenly has a much more significant adverse event in the waiting room, versus more integrated service with us in our clinical team and the clinical team of our partner, where maybe there's opportunities to have the patient take steroids while they're still at home and avoid that emergency department visit in the first place. So for me, I think that the technology is there to try and remove burden. It's there to try and take burden off the patient and the caregiver, not ask them to have to think about it. It's there to increase safety in therapies that have a high side effect profile, and if implemented correctly, should actually avoid putting burden onto the emergency department and other services where maybe that patient is not the most appropriate place for them to actually go.
Yeah, great. Zooming out a little bit, Matt, and kind of thinking about the horizon for this category of therapies, it seems to be a rapidly changing kind of space in terms of what's possible. So, what are some of those advancements that you're kind of keeping an eye on in CAR-T and bispecifics that are starting to be in that R&D pipeline?
Thanks, Katie. Yeah, I mean, we're chatting to a specialist audience, so I don't think anyone here needs me to say that the pipeline is expanding very rapidly, not just in indications, but also kind of earlier lines of therapy, movement to solid tumors. I think from our perspective, as people trying to facilitate outpatient care, seeing the sort of improved safety and dosing regimens, moving to subcutaneous dosing for bispecifics, better characterization of side effects, knowing when to expect what, all of those things help make patients more appropriate, not just eligible for outpatient administration and care. I think we're also, if there's one theme of this webinar, it's that it's not the tech, it's the workflow. And as the drugs themselves advance, we also better establish a standard of care for what an outpatient program and outpatient delivery should look like. And to me, working in this space, the advancements in delivery and the kind of group knowledge and movement of the cohort towards particular styles of delivery is sort of as important and interesting as a particular therapeutic.
Cool. I'm going to skip a couple if you're tracking on our outline, because I'm watching the clock and we're way behind. So I'm going to pick up our pace a little bit and transition to some of those regulatory updates that we've seen happening. We probably all know, but just to anchor to this point, in June of 2025, the FDA eliminated those REMS requirements for all currently approved autologous CAR-T therapies. And that meant that the daily monitoring requirements were reduced to 1 week. The patients only need to remain near the facility for 2 weeks instead of 4. And those driving restrictions dropped from 8 weeks to 2. So those are some pretty significant changes in the requirements of what it takes to deliver these therapies. Matt, what is this signal about how regulators are starting to think about the maturity and or safety of these therapies?
Well, I think the regulators are moving along with the sort of community that's doing this, in that they're just gaining increasing confidence in providers' ability to safely manage the risks of these complex therapies. We're seeing key side effects like CRS and neurotoxicity either remain stable or fall with the new drugs and better regimens. Things like ICANS become much more predictable to certain subgroups, so people perhaps with pre-existing CNS disease. And one of, I guess, the key things that's come out of our research with Sarah Cannon is that in all the kind of therapeutic lines that we've looked at, the key events occur in those kind of first 14, 15 days post-infusion. So we're starting to be much more targeted in the way we monitor, and I think the regulators are taking that on board.
Yeah. Kind of with that in mind, Chris, what are you hearing from kind of the commercial teams at these biopharma organizations about how they're working to adjust those site delivery strategies kind of in light of some of these regulatory changes?
I mean, I think obviously like pharma, again, having spent so much on developing these therapies, wants to see these therapies widely deployed in the market. I think that's obvious. But I think what's interesting is that they want to see them widely deployed safely. And, REMS being dropped, obviously allows more decentralization of these therapies and more adoption. But that possibly comes with a negative consequence of potentially more adverse events. And I think that's where there's been interesting partnership between us and some of the manufacturers, that there's an opportunity to use technology like ours and the associated clinical workflows to ensure that safety is being maintained, even as we are increasing the adoption of these therapies and as they're going into locations where they maybe haven't been done before.
And so even as some of the regulatory frameworks are evolving, that doesn't, as you said, doesn't change kind of the risk profile of these products. So Matt, I'd love to dig into kind of some of the bits of juicy data that we've kind of worked in on this front. Starting with kind of like what have we seen about when those clinical alarms tend to kind of trigger for these different patient profiles that we've worked with, and how should providers approach that care model design to kind of account for those types of like alarming experiences?
Sure. So I guess with all of these things, you can have the monitoring in place, but the important thing is who's watching the monitor and what happens when an alarm goes off. I mean, with these drugs, the key risks remain cytokine release syndrome, neurotoxicity. They're still in the box warnings, but there's also sepsis, there's also cytopenias, there's also the consequences of frailty. So when you think about escalation, workflows, what data to capture, again, it's about thinking about the whole patient. What we do tend to see is that you get alarms out of hours. That's because there are more out of hours than there are in hours, but it means that when you have a very small group of dedicated clinicians giving these treatments, you have to find some sort of force multiplier for them so they can look after the broadest range of patients. And that's one of the reasons why we have our 24/7 virtual nursing service, because it means that no matter what time of day, there is that additional capacity for triage, which allows, what maybe one or two hematologists in an institution who are leading these programs to actually get some sleep while their patients are cared for during the course of their treatment.
Yeah, everybody getting sleep is a good thing. Big fan of that. Chris, how can providers and pharma best position themselves to align with what we're seeing in terms of the payer expectations of this space?
I mean, I think that there's a couple of challenges. The first one is obviously like the wave of specialty therapies, particularly the therapies that we're talking about right now, is from the payer and employer perspective, adding cost to the system. Now, at a societal level, you should maybe expect that cost will come down long term because we're curing diseases that perhaps needed long-term care before, or we are allowing individuals to return to the workforce, which is obviously, as a society, excellent. Unfortunately, in this country, we've created a system of like annual enrollment, which means often from the payer perspective, just economically, the value doesn't necessarily accrue in that particular year. And that is one of the reasons why preventive care in the US has been so tricky. I think, though, the most important thing is like the genie's kind of out of the bottle on this. Like these drugs are here, they're curative. You can't keep them from patients. So this is happening whether we like it or not. And we see government action to try and encourage broader networks. We see it like with that Texas law that I mentioned before, requiring state regulated plans to cover it within Texas. So this is happening. Employers are going to have to cover it. Like I don't believe that restriction of network or restriction of access will be possible long term, not for drugs with these kind of outcome benefits. So then the question becomes, okay, cool, if we know we're going to have to cover them, let's do it in the most cost-effective, safe way we can to achieve the best outcome for the patient. And I think there's different models there, from center of excellence models to potentially moving on to more bundled case rates. But I think the most important point for us as Current Health is like, how can we help show that these drugs are being delivered in the safest, most cost-effective way possible? We believe, obviously believe and are seeing the data that outpatient is both the safest way and the most cost-effective way, and show that the patient is having the best possible outcome they have. If we're spending $500,000 on this drug, let's make sure the patient is having the best outcome that they possibly can get from that therapy. And that's what we're trying to bring.
All right, great. We're going to have to leave our discussion there for this time together. I've got a quick plug. I'm going to show those email addresses one more time in case you want to send any questions to our speakers. A lot of the content that we've shared today, we've packaged up in a new white paper, so we're going to send you that as well. I hope that you found this session enjoyable and interesting. Like I said, please email Chris or Matt if you have any questions about what we've talked about today. And if your organization is thinking about how to evolve how you deliver these specialty therapies, please give us a shout. We would love to help. Thanks so much for being here, and hope you have a great day.
Thanks, all. Bye.